Be here now. Just be here now.
Welcome to the Set and Setting podcast with Madison Margolin. As a journalist, Madison has spent years exploring the intersection of psychedelics, cannabis, and culture. This podcast brings together thought leaders from today's psychedelic renaissance to talk about the role of psychedelics in our inner and outer lives. You can support this podcast and find additional resources at BeHereNowNetwork.com/Madison.
Hey everyone, I'm Madison Margolin. This is the Set and Setting podcast, and we have with us today Jason Pinsky, an old friend and mover and shaker of many things. Jason, thanks for coming on.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm so stoked to be here.
Yeah, so me too. I'm really happy to have you. So I'm going to just read your bio here, and then we're going to get into the questions.
Sounds good.
Jason Pinsky's diverse career in music, technology, food, and cannabis is often self-described in a 4-point geometric configuration known as the Pinsky Triangle. The former Chief Cannabis Evangelist at Eaze and Cannabis Producer for VICELAND's Bong, Appétit was a prolific cannabis connoisseur starting in 1994 when he judged the first High Times Cannabis Cup in Amsterdam. In 2014, after a decade of opioid dependency due to a spinal injury, Pinsky used cannabis to help wean himself off pain medication completely. His story and advocacy led to his participation in the passing of New York State's Compassionate Care Act, and in 2016 he helped expand the program to include chronic pain as a qualifying condition for patient access. Pinsky's technology background dates to 1993 as a founder of Image Info, who created technology solutions for the fashion industry, and Haze City, who provided consultation on digital and live music strategies for major music artists. Pinsky is also a partner of Zagat. Zagat. Did I pronounce Fetzau correctly?
It's Fetzau.
Fetzau.
Yes,
Fetzau.
It's good. It's good. Close enough.
Rated #1 for barbecue in New York City since 2005. Fetzau means what? Fat pig?
Fat pig in German. I know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the perfect type of restaurant for
Williamsburg, Brooklyn. I put
kosher
Coke. I put kosher Coca-Cola, the Mexican Coke, on the menu because it's kosher. So
you have to have one kosher thing at the big place.
Yeah. Of course. Of course.
Yeah. So for everyone here, I've known about Pinsky, I think since 2015 when I was working at the Village Voice, and I was dying to write a story on you. And I think this might be the first official time that I'm interviewing you for something all these years later.
Wow, amazing. Well, I should just start by saying that you're actually my favorite human, if in fact we are human. But amongst beings and living souls and our higher consciousness, appropriate for today's content. I have so much love for you, Madison. I want to just start by I want to interview you more than I want to be interviewed by you. But it's been a really great becoming friends with you and watching for both of us as we've had so many amazing experiences and knowledge and accomplishments.
Oh, well, we can make this a co-interview, and I'm really just honored and excited to finally be doing this officially. So let's just start, who are you? What are you doing in the world? How did you get to kind of where you are today? And then, we'll get into the rest of it.
I guess it is an interesting question because I've been examining who am I?
There's been so many iterations of Jason Pinsky.
Well, the most look, I'm classically trained as a New Yorker. Lived in New York my whole life. Came out to California about 4 years ago now to work full time in content and cannabis. I don't know. I'm a classic New York Jew. I mean, why do you think we like each other? My 23andMe actually came back saying I'm a 100% full Ashkenazi Jew, which is unique because I don't think I ever scored 100 on anything growing up. So that was kind of a good thing. But I've been my relationship with plant medicine probably. My mom is an amazing human. She dealt with the the arts basically growing up. She taught ballet in our basement, had a creative studio. So I always grew up around creative types, and the babysitters that would babysit me would be her teachers, for her dance studio. And, this is, I'm a child of the 70s, Staten Island. And I always had that smell, but I didn't necessarily know what it was until probably when I was 13. I was at Jones Beach, and my first concert, it was the Beach Boys. And you have that, what do they call it? That concert smell. You're like, I remember that. So my relationship with weed probably started peripherally as a kid. I think it's a rite of passage for every young man at his bar mitzvah to sneak out into the parking lot and go smoke a joint, with your older brother and friends. I'm sure you have some experience with that, Madison. But
my dad got high with the rabbi at my brother's bar mitzvah, actually.
Yeah, exactly. So that's not surprising. But yeah, I started smoking weed when I was 13, 14. When I got into high school, I realized that it made more sense to buy an ounce and hook up, 5 of my friends and keep a couple of, a quarter ounce, or 6 friends and keep a quarter ounce for myself. I moved into New York City in the early 90s. I think music has been a big influence for me. I played piano growing up. My musical roots probably stemmed a lot from my parents being children of the 60s to us kind of following in that footsteps. So my first Dead show was in 88 when I was 16 years old. 89, I was 16, 15 in 88 with the Grateful Dead. I started seeing Fish in 92. Moved into New York City, and when I would go to see Fish and the Dead, I would be a taper, so I would record shows. And then because I had this recording equipment, I lived in New York City. I would go out to see music 3-4 nights a week, and I'm watching all this amazing, performance happening. And it's so interesting because live music is experiential, and you're in the moment, and then it's gone. Mm-hmm. And for me, it was almost like I couldn't allow that to happen. I was like, well, shit, man, I have this recording gear, and I can actually capture this moment and almost like a historian of sorts. It felt equally as much of a passion of mine as an obligation of mine, right? Mm-hmm. To really be able to capture what was happening in the downtown music scene in the early 90s. Mm-hmm. And that's really, I think music and weed, you'd go to Dead shows and obviously that kind of community. So I think that was really my first, early connection was probably with music and weed. Mm-hmm. And in the early 90s, I went to the first Cannabis Cup. Actually, you and I think, met probably on the Cannabis Cup circuit 20 years later. Right. But my first cup was actually in 94. And I was 21 years old, and it was for a kid who had been smoking pot and reading High Times since I was 16, since 86 or whatever. I keep doing the math wrong. You notice I was 16 in 86, 88, and 89. But when I was a youth, the two youths, Your Honor, right? When I was a youth, I would read High Times, and by 94, I got to go, actually to the promised land and see what a cannabis marketplace looked like. And it was interesting because at that time I was like, man, this is what I want to do. But then coming back to New York and seeing, 94 was a very different time. People were still getting busted for growing, for selling. I mean, for me, though, it was kind of the genesis of Mexican weed that I had gotten, which was less expensive. I think the early 90s was when the whole world woke up to kind bud, right? To the difference between outdoor grown to the guys in the late 80s brought seeds from Cali out to Holland. And by the early 90s, all that tech for greenhouse tech was now being applied toward weed. And you started to really see, really killer varieties coming out. So my crew is we're the Sour Diesel guys from New York. We're the Chem Dog family. I met Greg, who's the Chem father, on the plane to Amsterdam for the first Cannabis Cup in 94, right? Just to put it into perspective. So, I mean, I spent that time in Amsterdam really kind of like realizing that this is what I wanted to do. But coming back to New York, it's highly illegal. And at this time, the other kind of interest for me was tech. And I was early into computers. I was early into going online. Through my experience with Fish, actually brought me into the internet through Fishnet and all the message boards and all the community that when you were tapers, it's like we had our own like internet that we could all communicate on. And I mean, I was doing this shit on modems in 91, 92 when I was in college. So technology always resonated. And my brother and I actually started a software company in 94. And we did that throughout, the 90s. We sold it 5 years later. But by day, I would be in tech. And then at night, and that would pay the bills. And then at night, I would have my passion points, right, which was music and weed. And, that kind of connecting the dots, and we'll get into that a little bit later, has kind of been like, the joy is really taking all these. You mentioned how many times I've reinvented myself. Actually, it's slightly like that, but it's more like, having new experiences and figuring out how to connect the dots into all of those different things. So fast forward now, I don't know, I guess in the late 90s, I left Image Info. That was our fashion technology company, and started a company called Music Vision. And Music Vision built and hosted websites for Outkast and Christina Aguilera and NSYNC and 311. I mean, all the big pop artists in the early 2000, about 20 years ago. And for me, this was now like in the 90s, I was doing fashion technology. My dad had an apparel company. My brother and I wrote software for his business, and that kind of launched into, its own company. And it was fashion technology in the 90s. And then 10 years later, it was music technology. And that kind of got me, again, I started as a taper at Fish shows, but I started basically a production company. And that was my business called Haze City. And Haze City was kind of like my digital playground for music and tech and weed. I didn't know it was the Pinsky Triangle like 15 years ago, right? But anyway, that was an interesting time and really got me like back into the music space kind of more full time. And when that transitioned, I realized I had just working 10 years in like corporate tech startup world. And now I kind of wanted to like have a different experience because I had all these relationships with bands. I leveraged that to go out on the road. So I started to work with Fish, and I was their IT director on the road. I was with them for a couple of years at various festivals and tours. And I was like, Fish and Dave Matthews were like the first bands to bring technology like out on tour with them. So I was really fortunate to be able to be the guy to do that. And after a couple of years of that, I was in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and we bought a place. And Williamsburg was like also like a blank canvas. So a friend of mine and I started Feta Sal, the barbecue spot. It was ripe for the neighborhood in 2005. And then, as I started to become a staple in Williamsburg, I started to really get, involved with a lot of the local community. And that started to transition into me meeting a lot of the guys that worked at Vice down the block. If we're looking at timelines here, it was a significant piece of it is I injured myself in 2001 and needed spine surgery and was on OxyContin for pain management for almost about 15 years. So things get really interesting around 2012 when I was kind of in between gigs and I was like figuring out, okay, well, what am I going to do next? And for me, I had to like kind of establish like, I had worked a lot of careers, right, as we had mentioned, and I had good experiences and bad experiences. And as a matter of fact, the bad experiences are actually the ones that you cherish the most, right? Because it's not about experience, right? It's about knowledge. And the knowledge that you gain from the experience is really, especially as I got older, I'm like, in my 30s, I thought I knew everything. I turned 40 and I realized I didn't know shit. Okay. so all of a sudden, like this quest for knowledge, like becomes important. And one of the things that I had learned is before I pick a path in terms of my career, and what do I want to do now for act 3 or act 4, I really need to hone in on my core values. Mm-hmm. And what are the things that are the most, important? And for me, like having passion for what I was doing, I later learned that is the Japanese concept of ikigai. To look it up, it's Ikigai, and it's like your reason for being. It's like what wakes you up out of bed every morning. It's like the Venn diagram or the flower of life of what the world needs and what you want to do and what can pay you, and just like all the intersection of all these really great things. But it's like, what are you enthusiastic about, and how do you use that to make your living? And I had worked in several different jobs, some higher paying than others, and it was almost like the more corporate, high paying ones just really sucked the soul out of you. And it became obvious that doing what you love, like that's the payment. It's not necessarily like the paycheck, or being unhappy. And if I look at that time in my life from 2001 to 2014, and for a lot of that, I think up until 2005, I was working in music, but then I brought my son, I had a baby in 2006, and all of a sudden it was like, well, shit, I need to make money. So I just went corporate. And that was probably the most challenging time for me. If I think back about being depressed or not liking what I was doing or not having that ikigai, it was probably around that time. And coincidentally, that was also like the tail end of me being on OxyContin and opiates. So, the cannabis movement in 2013 and 2012, as I'm in the process of figuring out like what I want to do next. New York was still like, totally illegal. There was rumblings of the medical program, but Colorado and Washington had just gone through referendum for adult use. Mm-hmm. And I was in New York, and I'm like, shit, man, I'm selling weed on the side, and I want to, and it's been music, and weed and tech. And I want to rotate the triangle now. So weed is on the top, right? And how do I do that? Well, if this shit's happening across the country in 2012, then it's going to happen eventually in New York. It's so interesting. It just happened in New York.
And now you're in California.
Well, that too. But I mean, like 12, 13, 14, 15, 17, 18, 19, right? 8 years later. So that was my thing, is I was like, what? I've had enough success in life. You notice I counted. I didn't want to be 16 again, right? And
so many sweet 16s.
8 years later, the New York program is actually just getting, kickstarted. But I knew that I wanted to make my career full-time cannabis. And for me, it was not really a quest. If I was looking at my core values, all right, there are many Pinsky triangles, okay? The career triangle I just talked about in music and cannabis and weed. My core values of loving what I do and beating to my own drum. Well, if you're connecting the dots on those, right, and listening to your inner voice, right? My inner voice was telling me, holy shit, man, I've been on OxyContin for 15 years. I just turned 40. Am I going to make it to 50?
Right.
Like, so what is my new job? I'm trying to figure out what my new job and what my core value is. Well, it's loving what you do, and it's listening to your inner voice. And if those things are talking to my inner voice, is saying, dude, I want to actually live. Okay. I have more work to do. I haven't completed Maslow's hierarchy of needs and found self-actualization. And this was before I even heard about man, as a New Yorker, I didn't even know who Ram Dass was, man, back in the day. You know what I mean? So it's just so interesting to have these postulations on my own, and then have them confirmed by other sage, wise, people that have their own philosophy on stuff. But that was it for me, man. I knew that my job needed to be me. I was trying to figure out what my core values. Well, it's passion for what I do and listening to my inner voice. And those two things were talking. They were saying health. was it.
Right.
And I knew at that point I needed to lose 100 pounds and I needed to get 100% off the opiates. Like, that's it. And I made that my commitment in January 2013. And it was just after Colorado and Washington made weed legal. And I'm sitting to myself saying, oh, I want to be in the weed business. And, oh, but I want health to be like my full-time thing. And then I was like, oh, wait a minute. Well, let me just like connect the dots between cannabis and health and how that impacts me. Mm-hmm. And that was really like, the kind of aha moment where I was like, I'm going to take my technology background and I'm going to start and computer science knowledge, and I'm going to apply it to cannabis science. And I'm going to learn everything I can about the endocannabinoid system and the cannabis chemistry, the chemistry of the plant and the biology of the body and how they interface. And I'm going to use weed to get off opiates, man. Like, that was my goal. And right at that same time, I connected again. This is right around the time that you and I met. I connected with High Times 20 years later and finagled myself to start to judge concentrates. And it was that experience of judging concentrates that gave me access to the medication that I needed to get off opiates. It was like the universe just like provided, because New York didn't have a program. There was no way that I could get access to medication. And I had been smoking weed for, I don't know, like 20, 30 years at that point. And just smoking cannabis flower wasn't having the same impactful impact on me that concentrates were. I was a dab judge, you know what I mean? So like, I was really fortunate to get access to that medication. And from 2013 through the middle of 2014, it took me a year and a half, but I completed the goal. I lost the weight and I got off the opiates, and it really started to kind of open my eyes. And through that process, I helped craft the legislation in New York State. I used my own experience.
The legislation for medical marijuana.
For medical marijuana in New York State. I used my own experience of getting off opiates to then 2 years later get chronic pain as a qualifying condition. The guys from Vice that knew me were like, let's go with you up to Albany and watch you in the state capitol and press conferences. So that opened up really my official relationship with Vice, was they were kind of covering me as a news story. Mm-hmm. And then as it turned out, I, as Bong Appétit, came into existence, here I am in Williamsburg, the weed guy, the restaurant guy. And it really just made a lot of sense for me to come on board. And we started producing, filming Bong Appétit in late 2016. We did 40 episodes over the next 2 years. We became the number one, show on VICELAND with 43 countries, syndicated, 17 different languages. I mean, just like it really, for me, started to give me a platform to expose cannabis for what it really is, for the plant medicine that it really is, and rephrasing it in a different format than with the intention to get high. We did a lot of innovative stuff on Bong Appétit with non-psychoactive uses of the plant, with just terpene extractions that were used for flavor and fragrance in the food. We really kind of rewrote the narrative to a global audience on weed. So that got me out to Cali. And since the show is seasonal and like every piece of content eventually jumps the shark, I found this company Eaze. And when I first found the guys
Eaze,
at Eaze,
the cannabis delivery service,
so
essentially.
Eaze is a technology platform that is initially, when they were on the Tonight Show or talking about Kimmel did like the opener, it was like the Uber of weed, right? Mm-hmm. The interesting thing is it's faster than that. All right. You can order Uber and in 30 minutes, they'll come with the pizza, but Eaze will bring the weed in about 15 minutes. So you can get nice and high right before, so you can get the munchies. So here I am looking at it, like I'm thinking to myself, holy shit, like, it's a technology company. Well, that's a point on the triangle, right? It's for me, it looked like, even though it was like a way for consumers to buy weed, I looked at it as this is the next chapter of patient access. Mm-hmm. Like what better tool could there be to have a vehicle like Eaze that could get the plant medicine to the people immediately? Right. It was just such a extension of the work that I was trying to do in terms of broadcasting the message, well, I'm going to broadcast the message all over the world, and now I'm going to get the product to you right away. And that was really a wonderful thing. My title at Eaze was I was the Chief Cannabis Evangelist. And, you know, I wasn't the Eaze evangelist, the big difference. I was the cannabis evangelist. And, you know, what that did was that got me out, like I said, to Cali. I spent 2 years there. And that's, I got to say, man, and this should bump into some of your other, I know we've got a whole bunch of stuff to talk about. I hope it wasn't too much of an open. I've condensed it into about 20 minutes. In the past, that used to take me about an hour and 20 minutes. So so good on us for being able to do that. But really, like, you know, I had my experience with psychedelics had been, you know, when in the woods with my friends when I was 16, or mostly in music settings, mostly in concerts and stuff like that. And when I got out to Cali, I started to not only fall in with the upper echelon of the cannabis community, but also with the psychedelic research community. And then
who were those people? The psychedelic research community.
Well, I mean, so I was up at Shulgin's. I got invited to the farm up in to Shulgin's lab.
For those who don't know, Alexander Shulgin is the person who popularized MDMA, but also created a bunch of novel psychoactive and psychedelic compounds.
Yeah, so that was kind of eye-opening to me. There are a few other individuals that I probably shouldn't mention by name that were super connected to the chemistry side of things. So that was also really interesting. And but really, I think it was also like living out in the beach. You have to remember, I was in the concrete jungles of New York City, and then what a contrast to come out to Venice Beach. And you know, there's a guy named David Alexander English. He's an artist that's on the boardwalk in Venice, and he's the guy that makes all the flower of life. He hand draws them. It's like incredible. And he became a guru of mine of sorts. And David cued me in that actually, like, you know how there are like ley lines on the planet and there's different energy places, and certain people, like certain places vibrate at a different frequency. Well, Venice is actually like, there's supposedly a negative magnetic anomaly out in the Pacific about a mile out that like extends right up the coast from like Malibu down to, you know, through the beach cities and goes in. And the reason why there's such a high vibe here is because it's like that kind of like, you know, place on the earth.
Wow.
And it really started to, like, coming out to Cali, I think really opened up my whole psychedelic journey and kind of looked at it in a much different perspective.
So yeah, I want to get into that. And a few things that I picked up on as you were talking was, you know, you were talking about this relationship between cannabis and music, and, you know, talked about the Grateful Dead and Fish. And, you know, so many of the people, you know, my parents also, like, children of the 60s, you mentioned your parents too. I don't know if your parents are into the Dead, but, you know, so many people of that generation really, like, were able to experience or embody this, like, you know, alignment or like flow kind of, like, I think when you combine psychedelics or cannabis with, you know, jam band music, you know, it just kind of is this magical synergy. And so it seems like that's kind of been this guiding light in your life a little bit. And at the point when you decided, when you were on the opioids and you wanted to, like, get back into cannabis, it was like, you know, the cannabis is the thing that really helps you, like, align and get into that flow state. So I wanted to ask you, you know, like, what's your experience of flow state? Like, how do you embody, like, being here now or presence, and, like, where in the Pinsky Triangle do all of those things kind of fit together to allow you to sort of, like, be vibing at that, like, high state?
Well, I'm incredibly high all the time. So that's the high state right there, I should say. No, it's not true. It's actually, I use cannabis less. I can't remember anything actually these days. It's which is really interesting because I lead a stress-free existence. I don't know. I got to say that I'm glad you connected the dots with music. As I started to get into weed and started to get into, like, how weed was grown, right? And if you look at the tech behind lighting, right? There was one bulb you used for veg growth, and then another bulb you used for flowering. And one was kind of like the spring spectrum of the sun, and the other was kind of like the fall spectrum of the sun. And then they got into LED lighting, which is kind of the norm these days, where you could dial in the spectrum, specifically. I had always been a sound engineer. I always knew about the spectrum of sound, the frequency of sound, and how notes, sound have a lower, decibel number, and then a higher frequency on the, as a music engineer. What I didn't have is the same knowledge of the spectrum of light and how light is also a frequency. So when I got out to Cali, probably was in Santa Monica in 2017, walking down the street, and I literally it felt like a glove pulled me into this bookstore. It's called Thunderbolt Books in Santa Monica. It's like a crystal shop. And literally, I wasn't even going there, but all of a sudden, I was swept into the store. And I became friends with the guy, and I started to look at all this cosmic spiritual stuff. I went in, I think I got what's the book? It's called, I'm looking at it in The Secret Teachings of All Ages by Manly P. Hall. All this old, for me, I was just in my 40s. I was just old enough to start to study Kabbalah. For me, I was really interested in the connection between science and spirituality. I was just hearing about quantum physics and all these different, the Pinsky Triangle actually is multidimensional. It's not 3 points. It's a 4-point geometry. So that's a tetrahedron. And the tetrahedron then is also the first 3-dimensional shape that comes out of the flower of life. And that sacred geometry is the same shape that's in all the quantum physics when you get down really small. And my mind is being blown by connecting the dots and all this stuff. And the guy who owns the store gave me, he's like, here, I want you to have this. And it was Be Here Now. And it was just such a profound, he's like, listen, we sell this book, but he explained the difference between he's like, I don't even like to sell it. I just like to gift it. And that was kind of my first introduction to that. It really started to kind of align me in terms of the philosophy of when you look at things on the quantum level, everything is just string theory. Everything's just vibrating. And those vibrations are not only is the vibe coming from the sound, the music around us, it's coming from the lighting, right? The sound has frequency, light has frequency. Guess what also has frequency? Us. There's a reason why you and I like each other, right? Because when we get together, it's a harmony, right? And that's because of how we are resonating. So I would say that what gets me into flow state? Music, 100%, live music, and it helps me, and weed for sure. Lately, maybe a stem and a cap also. But I think that's really for me when I could, and it's not even putting the headphones on. I think it's really important. Everyone is on their phones and their AirPod Pros, and everyone's just listening right in their ear. But there's nothing like the live music experience of feeling the energy of the music, coming at you, feeling the bass in your chest, and really getting to experience it, not just through your ears, but through, all of your senses. I think that definitely puts me into flow state.
I mean, I think also when you're talking about experiencing something through all your senses, you're talking about embodiment, and that, in the course of the interviews I've been doing for this podcast, that's been a major theme, is experiencing something with your whole body kind of gets you to be here now in a different way. You get out of your head and into your body, and all of a sudden you're present, and the senses, the physical senses are kind of what bring you into that presence almost. It's they carry you into that. But, and I, again, you mentioned also something about a stem and a cap. So I'm curious, how psychedelics have been part of the journey, because cannabis especially is so obviously of you.
Well, I would say that traditional paths, right? So it was weed and it was like, mushrooms and LSD, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then as I started to get a little bit more connected with the research community, it was like ketamine and DMT. So here's what happens. It's like mushrooms and not micro. I mean, and it was never like the term microdose didn't even exist back in the day, right? It was always a heroic dose. But it's a commitment. It's hard to eat acid and just take that much time out of your life. You need a day to trip. You need a day to recover, especially as you get older.
Mm-hmm.
What was interesting to me about ketamine and psilocybin, ketamine and DMT, is it's short acting. It allows you to kind of punch in and punch out, and it doesn't have to consume your entire experience. And plus, it's a totally different realm. So the thing that made it accessible, I think, is when people started putting DMT in vape pens. Mm-hmm. And making the delivery method really easy. Again, this is technology. Like, hey, we're just taking cannabis extraction technology and applying it to a different plant and making it accessible. I actually don't have the experience of the mother ayahuasca. I didn't want to like do it up in like someone's place in Malibu or up in Woodstock. Like for me, I want to do ayahuasca in Peru or somewhere in South America. So I haven't yet had the chance to do that. But it's like I look at obviously it's the same ingredient. DMT in a vape pen is like the advancement of technology. It used to take like years to like go across country from New York in a covered wagon. Now we fly across country in 6 hours. So the difference between ayahuasca preparation is like an ancient form of preparation. Now we're taking the same main ingredient and making it more accessible. And I think through those experiences, it's allowed me to kind of, when you step out of your consciousness, and I like to keep my eyes open. A lot of people say you close your eyes, and I actually have a different philosophy. I want to see how reality changes with the little catalyst. And remember, it's not the little amount of the substance. The little amount of the substance that you're taking is the catalyst. It's us that are really. It's just like unlocking something that's already within us. So I think those experiences, and because like, when you trip out, like, and you have a big, psychedelic experience, you also want to put a bunch of time in between that. But when it's so convenient, and you got to respect it, man, you don't want to like be bringing the DMT vape pen like out, Although I will say it is an interesting experience to hit the DMT vape pen sitting down in a live music setting. If you haven't tried that, like smoking weed for the first time, and I wouldn't suggest piercing the veil. But like, a little edge on that really just makes the whole thing. So because we had the ability to make these things so accessible and such short acting, I had an amazing opportunity to experience it over and over and over the last like several years.
Do you feel like you can blast off with the DMT pen? Because in my experience, it's harder to get as high.
So it depends on, well, first of all, it depends on what you've got inside of it, just like anything else. So our friends are taking DMT and they're making it into distillate, right? So if if you think of it as a weed pen, when you distill it, it's increasing the potency. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you got to also make sure you have the right voltage and battery and that you're taking clouds. Yeah, I've seen it fail, because it's not like all the right like electronics hooked up.
Right.
But it regardless of how, for me, it was like a really interesting experience, like keeping my eyes open and feeling like I was in the same place, but now my perception of reality was different. I was just watching one of these animated YouTubes. It's called After School, SKOOL with a K. Mm-hmm. And they do a thing on Ram Dass, and it's animated. He's talking about how, like, we're in these spacesuits, right? And we're we're observing on different channels, how we look at other people. We look at like their personality, or we look at their psychology, or like, all this different stuff. For me, I think that like we're all tuned in, humanity is all tuned into the same reality. Mm-hmm. And when you and when you pierce the veil through plant medicine, right, it enables you to kind of switch the channel, right? I wouldn't necessarily call it like a parallel universe, but it's like now all of a sudden I've my perception, the frequency, think of it like a television antenna. And it is like a television antenna, right, Madison? Because we're transmitting frequency and we're receiving frequency.
Yeah, you're picking up different channels now.
Totally. So the question is, now you turn the station, and all of a sudden you go from like Fox News to like the Cartoon Network, and it's like, whoa, dude, but you're still in the same place, So it's like I think that's been a really like eye-opening thing for me in terms of like thinking about what is reality, right? Is you can't really study what reality is or consciousness is unless you alter your reality or alter your consciousness, mm-hmm. In order to be able to like compare the two.
Right. And so you said sitting down at a concert and hitting the DMT pen. Is there any concert that you've done that or recommend any particular music that goes along with that experience?
I mean, like, it's called Dead and Company these days, but it's at the Hollywood Bowl 2 summers mm-hmm. ago. Yeah. You want to be careful when you like, again, I'm considering myself like a psychonaut, mm-hmm. right? Like I'm looking at this as experimentation, right? So like, I want to have that experience of like, what's it like to do these things in a low enough dose so that you're just kind of getting that glow and you could still exist. Ketamine's the same way, right? Like you don't want to do that irresponsibly. A lot of the formulations these days have like a tablet that you could take and you just suck on it like a sucking candy. And it's like having, 2 glasses of wine, you know what I'm saying? Or something like that. So yeah, but when again, if you use the catalyst to change your perception of reality, and mm-hmm. then you're in an environment that's already very stimulating, and then it's slightly altered, it's just a really like a wonderful way. And it makes you really ask yourself, what is real? Right. Like we're all agreeing on what, reality is, but what does a room full of tripping people agree on in terms of reality?
Well, I think that's sort of the like the namesake for this podcast, right? Set and Setting, which, Ram Dass, or when he was Richard Alpert, and Tim Leary came up with at Harvard, is the mental state that you're going into a psychedelic experience with, and then like the environment that surrounding that experience. Like those are all sort of ways that alter reality. Like the reality of the trip is going to be different based on these factors.
Where you are. Yeah.
Like and so, which begs the question, like what is objective reality, right? So like, because Set and Setting it's always there, and it's always different, and it's always so dependent on the person and the place, like then what is objective about the thing that's being filtered through that Set and Setting? Right. And if you think about also like where we are right now in history with the pandemic and politics and, the climate crisis and stuff, everyone has a different truth about what the reality of the situation is, so much so that, I think the objectivity and truth, and it's kind of become a very psychedelic moment where people are really having to investigate themselves and like their relationship to that objective reality. And
COVID had many silver linings. Mm-hmm. I think the first thing is that it accelerated again technology and kind of added another layer of community.
Right.
So, for example, like I've been a gamer my entire life and a tech guy my entire life. So having the concept of a video conference, something I've been doing for 20 years, so what we're doing right now, but like, or living in as a gamer, playing massively multiplayer online role-playing games. Like I probably spent 20, 15 years deep inside of World of Warcraft. You know what I'm saying? But what you have there, right, is you have communities of people that are all collaborating globally in a rich environment, okay, digitally. And for gamers, and then COVID came, and then the rest of the world caught up to that through things like this, through Zoom, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm like, Zoom is kind of like kindergarten in terms of like how technology allows communities to exist online. Look at the gaming world. Mm-hmm. And I mean, like, I have friends that I've never met, right, that are in different places of the world that I've been friends with for, over a decade through these rich experiences. So when COVID happened, the next chapter of curiosity for me that became obvious was like, again, connecting the dots. It was the intersection of psychedelics and virtual reality. Mm. So when you talk about set and setting, and let me just be clear as a footnote, I do not suggest that you go out and find a DMT pen and smoke it at the Grateful Dead show. Okay. Like, be more intentional with it. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. If you're experienced and you want to like be able to like be like, oh, I wonder what this is like, and you're with a friend who could like keep an eye on you, all that, right? But in VR, and this is what's happening with graphics technologies and whatnot, right? Like the line is blurring very quickly between something that you see on a screen or in a virtual environment. It's becoming indistinguishable from reality. Mm-hmm. And for me, it's like, well, now you could strap this headset on and you could literally be in another place. And, now you have a visual acuity and you might have an audio thing, and it's coming where they call it haptics, where you could feel sensation on your body, or there's a fan where you could feel a wind thing, or there's a little box that puts out a little scent. You know what I'm saying? And these virtual like experiences are really starting to become all encompassing. And for me, I'm like, oh, well, I wonder how it would be to like be in VR on ketamine. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think anyone's really done that yet. I don't think anyone's like in these virtual experiences experimenting with psychedelics.
They do like virtual like ayahuasca trips now. Like you can do a whole VR headset and it'll like set the visuals and the sounds to like what it would look like under.
So this is a really interesting point. Okay. And I'm actually working, well, you know about this, right? Reconscious Medical, right? Mm-hmm. Where I'm advising Dr. Mark on, he's got a ketamine clinic that does their sessions online. And it's the same, type of thing. And I was basically thinking to myself, for phase 1, it would be interesting to look at how psychedelics can enhance the virtual experience. Mm-hmm. But really, the brain doesn't know, right? When you're dreaming, right? Your brain electric signals are like the same as when you're like awake. Your brain can't tell the difference. So if we could really trick the brain, then that's exactly the question. Maybe phase 1 is in psychedelic therapeutics is through Zoom. Mm. Maybe phase 2 is in VR. Maybe phase 3 is you could create such a rich experience that you don't even need the psychedelics.
Right. So you're saying you could create such a sensory rich experience that it's psychedelic in and of itself.
It feels like you're tripping. It'll fool your brain. Maybe the catalyst is like, it isn't necessarily, so that's the kind of like, when I think about where my passions lie and what I'm curious about, it's like, as a technology guy and a futurist, I'm always thinking what's like, 5 years out and what's ahead. Mm-hmm. And I'm really curious to see how the evolution of virtual reality time psychedelics unfolds.
If you think about the psychedelic experience, right, like, for me, a good mushroom trip, for instance, or, even DMT, like what it does, it like brings you into this like full sense of presence, right? In a way where you're in mundane life, you're not necessarily able to get to as easily by yourself. Whereas if you're doing a virtual reality thing that is like the sensory overload, that also is bringing you like straight into presence and into your body in a way, again, that like mundane life doesn't do. I think that's why people go to like these these floating tanks,
tanks,
sensory deprivation tanks.
Yeah.
And all the things that like basically just like get you to get out of your own like internal mental mishigas, and like into the moment that is surrounding you in physical present reality. And maybe that's what we're talking about, like what is objective reality, like that maybe that is kind of what psychedelics do is they say that they dampen the default mode network, which is where the ego resides. And so when like the boundaries of the ego and like the self-centered lens through which you kind of experience the world falls away, maybe you're seeing something more objective.
It'll be interesting to see how that unfolds, for sure.
So I just wanted to follow up on, you mentioned the Pinsky Triangle. So let's just
Expand on it.
Lay it out. Yeah. Like, what is it?
Well,
and like, how is it a spiritual philosophy, I would say?
Basically, so first of all, let me just say, we all, and to everyone listening, including you, Madison, like we all have Pinsky triangles, okay? They might, like yours might not be called the Pinsky Triangle for yours.
Okay.
Wouldn't that be weird? Wouldn't that be weird if everyone was like, wow, I have this Pinsky Triangle?
Like, I mean, you just like fill in your blanks, fill in your Pinsky.
Well, like I said, it started with me figuring out my career path, right? And it was music. Music turned into media, right? And then it was weed and connecting the dots on those, technology. Eventually, as my career expanded, I added a fourth point because I opened the restaurant in Brooklyn, Feta Sound, and it was media, food, weed, and tech. And I had mentioned in the past, it's really about connecting the dots, right? So, when I was in the 90s, when I was, recording, I had tech up here, but music and weed were really connecting. Then fast forward, I think when I started Bong Appétit, that was the first time when it was like, I was like, well, weed, media, and food, right? That's not just connecting 2 points, but that's connecting 3 points. That's going like what we call full triangle. And, that's what it's really about. Like when you could connect the dots, for most people, they have different points in their life that they establish, and connecting the dots between 2 of those points is, really an amazing thing. When you could connect 3 together, that's when, it really started to explode for me in terms of like, my how I viewed kind of the world. Then coming out to Cali and working with Eaze, added technology to the equation. Think about it. I was doing Bong Appétit was media, food, and tech, and Eaze was weed, media, and tech. So that was kind of when I realized that it kind of went fractal. And that's kind of the so if you think about the shape of a tetrahedron, it looks like a prism. Yeah. There's kind of like there's one triangle on this side, and that's the triangle of my core values, and then there's this side that has like the career triangle, and then this side is I'll get into another time. There's the Pinsky triangle of trust, right? Because in relationships, trust is the foundation, right, of all connected relationships. And then all of a sudden you're like, shit, I just ran out of points. Like there's only a limited number in this shape. But then when you really connect the dots of everything together, like I said, that's when it goes fractal. And then all of a sudden it's like unlimited triangles. Okay. So I think that's been, really like kind of the philosophy for me is establishing these points and connecting the dots. And when you do that, it's kind of like, poises you for explosive growth.
And I guess how does that relate to sort of like the, like kind of like what your soul really wants, right? Like you talked about like your intuition and kind of getting into this place of alignment. And my question for you is like, how are you able to really like tune into like what the points on the triangle should be? Like, is it through cannabis? Is it through music? Is it through just like talking to God or whatever it is, I think
it's just through experience. And being aware and awareness and realizing, it's really interesting. I said earlier how it's like I smoke a lot of weed. I can't remember anything, but somehow I've been able to weave, a lot of these experiences together. For me, like I said, as I got older, I started to realize that, experience was here and knowledge is actually at a higher value.
Mm-hmm.
And then you think about how do you gain the most knowledge? And Ram Dass talks a lot about this as well. It's through failure.
Mm-hmm.
It's embracing failure.
Right.
It's embracing the challenging experiences, and if you and through those failed experiences, gaining knowledge out of it. It's like, well, this experience might not have gone the way that I wanted, but at least I learned something from it, and then applying that toward your whole next thing. And this has been the most, kind of awakening moment for me, is realizing that like gaining the knowledge is only as good as your ability to pass it on. And that's why I work in media and content and messaging and trying to control the narrative, is because attaining that knowledge is really only good when you have a platform to disseminate it. And, most people don't have an opportunity like me to broadcast globally, right? In most cases, that happens in the home. And that's been my, since leaving Eaze, that's literally been my full-time job, is bestowing that knowledge upon my son and allowing him to have that same opportunity of growth, and then, passing that down generationally. And that's what I think it's really going to take, because we're at this precipice where we're looking at cannabis movement, which is carving the path of the psychedelic movement. And really, both things have a similar story in terms of, a century-old disinformation in terms of its intended use. And it's going to be a generational shift. It's not necessarily going to be taking everyone who already was raised to think one thing and retraining them to something else. Mm-hmm. It's going to be the new blood coming up that are just going to always grow up in a world where you could go into the pantry and pull out cannabis as food. Or it's just like, in your mocha at Starbucks is a dash of whatever different type of substance. I was going to say a dash of I don't know, whatever. It's interesting how mushrooms right now are like coming with different varieties and different strains, and just following that same path. I love it.
One question that I want to kind of get to, and it's sort of a conclusion, sort of future forward type of question, is, Ram Dass has this quote, "You think you're enlightened, go spend a week with your family." And
I haven't heard that.
It's a good one, right?
Yeah, it's a good one.
And you talk about your son, and kind of like, I remember one of the things that you showed me was a letter that your son wrote to you when he was really young, and you were campaigning for medical marijuana in New York, is it? Yeah, and your son just was saying how proud he was of you, or something really cute. And bringing, like you said, kind of like, how do you know something? Well, can you teach it to somebody? So like, for you, like, what is, cannabis driven, or like, what is psychedelic parenting, right? Or parenting that is of this consciousness and kind of ethos that we're talking about?
I think it's honesty is actually at the core of that. Most people have the philosophy of hiding certain things from your kids. Mm-hmm. I have a totally different philosophy. I think that if you don't hide it, if you make it more normal, everyone always wants to do what they can't, what they're not allowed to do. Mm-hmm. But if you kind of remove that barrier, now I'm not suggesting doing psychedelics or weed with your kids, but it's around the house. It's out in the open. It's phrased in a different conversation where a lot of it has to do with the intention. Mm-hmm. My whole narrative on plant medicine is non-psychoactive. My whole narrative on plant medicine is as an essential nutrient. You think of cannabis and the endocannabinoid system, and we've got 2-AG and an anandamide as the natural compounds that our body makes that mimics the same compounds that the plant produces. And
anandamide, so for people who don't know, is like kind of the bliss molecule.
Yeah,
as they say.
And our body creates it, right? So it's really interesting when you look at plant and entheogenic plants, as opposed to other compounds that are made in a lab, right? And it's specifically the ones that are of most curiosity to me are ones that already exist in nature and that already exist in our bodies. Right. So like, maybe it's a microdose of DMT in some sort of delivery that's not intended to get us high, but just allows us to open our minds.
Right.
Those are the way that I view cannabis as like water. Like we all know we have a certain 8 glasses of water that we need to maintain optimal hydration. And I think we need to supplement our endocannabinoid systems with phytocannabinoids from the plant to maintain that optimal level of hydration. So when you view it as a dietary supplement or as a food source, or when your intention is not to get high, but just to supplement the body and to give it the tools that it needs for maximum, potential and growth. Weed is like the endocannabinoid system. It's all about like the body, all of the different aches and pains and cancer and everything that's related to like having your temple, right, be optimized, right? Psychedelics is like the same shit for your brain. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, but I don't think it's responsible of us as humanity. Like it's like you can't build a skyscraper on a shitty foundation.
Mm-hmm.
So the cannabis movement happening first, which will allow humanity to kind of like get our bodies in balance, is the perfect precursor for the next chapter, which is expanding our consciousness and understanding what's happening, in our brains.
Amen.
And that's the messaging that you want to, really kind of convey to our to the people at large, but especially, to our children.
It's it's funny the way you're describing this, and for the audience who maybe isn't as clued into the chemistry and biology of things. Like, yeah, we have our endocannabinoid system, like a set of lock and keys between the receptors in our body and the compounds in the cannabis plant. By the same token, speaking of DMT, researcher Rick Strassman, who conducted, I think, the first FDA-approved DMT studies in the 90s, basically found that humans have an innate capacity to communicate with the divine. And we have endogenous DMT that is already created in the brain, I think, around the pineal gland.
Yep.
And so through the psychedelics, through specifically DMT, but I would assume also other psychedelics to an extent, we're basically unlocking something that is within ourselves in general and to begin with. And so this is kind of this process of self-actualization and self-discovery through tools that we already have.
Dude, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you look it up, it's a triangle. Go figure. The path to self-actualization. Also, footnote: there's a good chance, like if you look at the flora, over at Mount Sinai, right? Like the burning bush was definitely like an acacia bush. You know what I'm saying? For sure.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, this is a whole other, I've written extensively about, the Jewish biblical psychedelic connection, but yeah, I mean, for also the audience, acacia is a DMT containing plant, and the Jews, or the Hebrews, or whatever term you want to use, the Israelites, learned acacia extraction technology from the Egyptians, for whom acacia is central to their, theology. And so, as slaves in Egypt, they learned how to extract acacia, and then they took off and they're through the desert, and now they have this technology. And that somewhere along the way, Moses sees the burning bush and talks to God.
Yeah, I've had that experience, but not that experience, but like, it's definitely not definitely. It's curious to me, like what tool set they had in order to expand their minds in that sense.
They actually, I just learned, so there's something called Syrian rue, and pretty much to unlock the DMT and acacia, it's very similar to like the ayahuasca combination, where you have two plants that the MAOI unlocks the DMT. And so what they were doing in the Middle East is, if you take Syrian rue with the acacia, that's the way to unlock the DMT.
Amazing.
And so there are people I know who are doing Syrian rue Jewish ceremonies on the East Coast. But yeah, I think it's just like a really cool, like, returning to self, returning to home, returning to these like ancient technologies, to use the word, to really just like find ourselves and like find our highest capacity for connection. So,
well, that's why I'm, like I said earlier, like, now it's the intersection of virtual reality and psychedelics. 2-3 years ago, it was the intersection of quantum physics and spirituality, and seeing all those similarities. You know what I mean? Between, actually, it's like almost everything in science now is proving everything that was mystical, that was of lore, is now actually being like validated by science. That's really, really cool.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's funny. The scientists, they know, through their own technology, but this is like wisdom that's been already like embodied and known through, shamans and medicine people since the beginning of time. So anyways, Pinsky, is there anything else you want to talk about, add, any or all of the above?
Yeah, there is. For me, funny you should ask. For me, I think there's been a lot of conversations about, like, if I just look at the last, 10 years, the cannabis story and movement started through a medical movement, really. And over time, the states came out with medical legislation. Over time, that started to get replaced with adult use legislation. And then the story became, and then a lot of those medical programs got taken out in states, and now it's basically only adult use. Or if you have a medical card, it's like, oh, you get a medical card because you'll pay a little less at retail because it's taxed differently. And then as the cannabis business started to, turn more into for-profit, then, a lot of the social equity conversations started to come out. And then you have like, certain communities that we wanted to rise up, that have been persecuted by the war on drugs, and then certainly the people who have been arrested, right, and in jail. And I think that's the popular story right now. If you look at like Last Prisoner Project and a lot of the legislation and all these different states that are, having a strong social equity program and movement is really important. And I think that's really important. But what I think is more important is really getting back to the roots of this plant, not for profit, but for health and wellness. I think to some degree that's gotten lost a lot in the conversation. And interestingly enough, what's been the catalyst for me kind of remembering that is looking at what's happening with psychedelics and how the path to psychedelic freedom is now, again, starting through the medical movement. Right. So I think that's the one thing that I want to say is, like, we're going to see a lot of opposing forces as it relates to the movement, right? For profit, right, versus health and wellness, and how these tools. And I think it's really important to always make sure that the health and wellness. I mean, like, I want to tell a story that extends beyond whatever state you're in, that's borderless. I want to tell a story that extends beyond what color your spacesuit is. You know what I'm saying? Right. And I think that's really important to kind of get back to that. So I think that's going to be the next kind of focus for my narrative and messaging, is to remind everybody about the health and wellness. And like, just like you said, people don't know about the endocannabinoid system. They don't know that like these compounds exist naturally in our bodies, So I think it's important to get back to that story, because it was like the lead story, and then all of a sudden it kind of got not as widely told, and that's something for me that I'm going to try to get more into.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's so important. And, when you think about like being here now, right? Like if the here and the now is not a place where you want to be, because you're not feeling well in your body, or whatever the reason might be, if there's, injustice happening, whether it's in the cannabis space or the psychedelic space or whatever, like it's not enough to just be here now, in my opinion. But it's like, you have to like take the actions to actually create a present that is comfortable to be in. And I think that's where so much of like the spiritual work lies, and like where, it's not just like sitting and being and meditating and whatever, but like really doing the actions in the world, like, like tikkun olam in Hebrew, like, repair the world, fixing what needs to be fixed. And So yeah, I think that's a really good concept to, conclude on. And I want to say I'm so excited and so grateful to have you on, and always so much fun to talk to you and shoot the shit. We could probably go on for the next 3 hours.
Yeah, I would just say the same thing. Like, can we just hang out more? I mean, like, I think that the work that you're doing, I'm like trying to get like a billboard of just my face on Times Square. If you know anyone who can get me a bill, like, bravo, by the way, you guys.
Thank you.
Right?
He's referring to, there is a billboard of Double Blind, my magazine, in Times Square. So that was
cool.
exciting. Yeah.
So exciting. Yeah. I just want to close. I mean, like, we've talked about me for an hour or whatever. Madison, the work that you're doing right now is so important. And I couldn't think of a better person to be a forward thinking face of this movement. I'm so stoked to have you in my life. And this was wonderful today. I can't wait to continue to build with you.
Thank you, Pinsky. So just one more thing, how can the audience find you, find out more about you, your work, get in touch?
So I'm Jason Pinsky on social media channels, Facebook, Instagram, Pinsky. And please, I started to really realize, everyone is so caught up with likes and follows and whatnot. In the age of being home for a year, it's finally like the world is returning to in-person events and whatnot. Hopefully I'll see you guys out there. That's really like, if you see me, say hi, stop for a photo with my glasses, however you like it. But yeah, I'm Jason Pinsky on all social, and definitely, responsive in that realm.
Great. Thanks so much.